おはようございます。今日の朝のHoudini作業配信をやっていきたいと思います。今日は、Houdiniだったらおなじみのエンタグマさんのチュートリアルで面白そうなのがあったので、ちょっとやっていきたいなと思います。動画を流します。
Today we're going to build this, and it originated in our friend Patrick from AltShift asking a few questions when he was preparing this setup here, which I think is really beautiful and beautifully rendered as well. And I took some techniques learned from working on this setup and tried simplifying it a bit and using it to build this ball made out of rubber bands. And I think I managed to come up with a reasonably simple setup. So let's build this, and as usual, drop down it.
というわけで、ベラムを使ったシミュレーションです。今回は、こっちのチュートリアルもバージョン19なので、それに合わせてこっちも19のバージョンでやっていきます。はい、じゃあ、Houdiniに切り替えます。はい、バージョン19です。
GeoNode, dive in there, and let's configure a collider first, the sphere around which we're going to wrap our rubber bands, which, well, is a sphere. Let's use the sphere create in Houdini 19. That is the same sphere node just set up to create polygons, and let's just...
スフィアが19から昨日も気づいたんですが、ポリゴンの、スフィアのセットアップが変わってるので、そもそもなんでプリミティブなんだろうなっていつも思ってたんで、ポリゴンにしてくれたので、使いやすくなったなって気がします。
Switch it to polygons to create a triangular mesh instead of primitives. I increased the frequency quite drastically to give a really high-res sphere, and for some reason when preparing the setup I decided to scale this to a uniform scale of 0.71. I don't know what reasoning led to this kind of decision, let's just stick with it, and to this attach a null, which we're going to call out underscore collider. Okay, that's going to be the invisible sphere around which we're going to wrap the rubber bands. Let's create the rubber bands by dropping down a tube. Let's set the view flag on here and also scale this to a radius scale of 2.5, a height of 0.3. Let's add 4 rows and set this to set.
チューブもクリエイトとプリミティブが、これもしかしてプリミティブ全部クリエイトとプリミティブに変わった？そっか、セットアップ変わんないからか。そうなんだ。チームもクリエイトできたみたいですね。
Two columns. So we have almost square primitives here in this mesh, and let's set the connectivity to triangles like this. Now, as you've seen in the animation in the intro, these rings will spawn randomly rotated. So let's take care of that using a transform node, which we'll attach here. And under the rotation, I'll just use an expression using the rand function and feeding in the current frame number, multiplying it by some value, and then 3600 to randomly pick a rotation between 0 and 3600 degrees. Let's just copy and paste this expression in the second field, changing the number in here, and let's do it one more time, like so. So now if I hit play, this tube appears just randomly rotated on each frame. Okay, let's set this up for simulation using a vellum cloth. So vellum. configure cloth like this. And here I want to visualize the thickness. So that's how thick my rubber band is going to be, how thick the individual points on this rubber band are going to be, and those will be used for collision detection. In my case, as I will shrink the rubber band a bit, I'll just scale down the edge length a tiny bit to 0. And then down here, the stretch, I want to decrease the stretch stiffness a bit, but increase the stiffness drastically to high value like this, making sure my rubber bands don't wrinkle, leaving a bit of slack in their stretch constraint. And that's going to work in our case, because we'll employ a few other tricks to make sure that these individual rubber bands really shrink and contract towards the sphere. Okay, attach two nulls here. Let's call one out vellum geo, and the other one goes into the pink slot here. Let's call it out underscore constraints. Like this. Okay, time to drop down our vellum solver. In this case, I don't want to wire up the vellum geometry and the constraints directly. However, I want to wire up the colliders directly, so collider goes into the last slot in here in the vellum solver. And before I do anything to the solver or in the solver, let's just go to the Forces tab here and disable. Gravity by setting this value to 0 and then unchecking wind and also increasing the velocity damping to 1. Alright, now let's anything to the solver or in the solver, let's just go to the Forces tab here and disable the gravity by setting this value to 0 and then unchecking wind and also increasing the velocity damping to 1. Alright, now let's dive into the solver here. And the first thing we want to do is spawn these rubber bands. And I want to spawn one rubber band per simulation step. And in Houdini 19, there's the source input. And in here, I can wire in a vellum source. Let's do it like that. And then set its emission type to each frame and point it to the geometry and the constraints it should emit each frame. Luckily, we already prepared that, so the sub path here, I will point that to my obj geo1 out vellum geo, and the constraint subpath, I will point that to the out constraints. Let's go back to the geo level here, highlight the solver, and just check it out, hit play on the simulation. And we can see we are spawning all of these bands. However, they do not contract, they do pretty little currently. To have those rubber bands contract, I want to do two things. A, scale down their rest length, so they contract by themselves by just scaling down these connections in between the individual points. And then also, in order to prevent slippage on this collision sphere here, add a bit of a force, attracting those rubber bands to the center of the sphere. Let's dive into the vellum solver here and take care of the scaling down of the rest length first by using a vellum constraint properties node. And as I'm gonna do multiple things here, I wanna use a merge node, and the merge out goes into the force and the vellum constraint property goes into the merge. So first thing we wanna do here is scale down the rest length scale here of our simulation of our object here to 0.3. Again, that's a value which I figured out with lots of trial and error when preparing this setup. Okay, back to our main. Here again, let's simulate this. And we can already see those rubber bands contracting onto that sphere. However, what might happen later is that some of those rubber bands start slipping as they land on the sphere and collide with other rubber bands quite off axis. So they might just slip off of the sphere. And to prevent that, in the vellum solver in here, I'll add a pop attract force. So as vellum mainly works on point positions, and point positions are what are being influenced by the pop forces as well, by the particle forces, we can use those.
それでマージつけたのか。ポップアトラクトで原点を決めるのか。
In conjunction with vellum, and the pop attract is there to just attract our individual points towards the center. In our case, the center, the goal, is set to be 0. That's exactly the center of our sphere here, so we don't have to dial in anything here. Just in the forces tab, I want to increase the force scale to 10, and its maximum distance, I want to decrease that to 10. The last thing I want to do each simulation step is make sure that the velocity is totally damped, so we are not carrying over velocity from a previous simulation frame. And I'm going to do that using a pop wrangle, wiring this in the merge as well, and in here just setting our velocity to be 0. In this case, Houdini casts this 0 to be a vector. Alright, let's save this.
ベロシティ0にしてんのに0になってねえけど。どういうことなんだこれは。で、ライフルレストレングスのスケールに収縮させて、ポップアトラクトで収縮、重心点決めて、ポップアングルでベロシティを0にする。これこれで、 そっか、ベロシティをゼロにしてるからこれ動かないのもしかして。あ、しまった。116度前に行っちゃってる。やらかした。行っちゃってるよ。しまったで。マウスボタンか。消えないのか。消えた消えた。ないか。一回進むか。
This, and one last thing I want to make sure on the vellum source here, I want to disable the activation after a few frames, so let's only activate this as long as our frame range is below, I don't know, 64. So now these rubber bands will only emit until frame 64. Alright, let's go up one level and simulate this. So it kind of worked. It's being a bit jittery at the end, which we can resolve by, on the vellum solver, under the solver tab, increasing the substeps. So for my final animation, and that still jitters a bit in the end, so it might need more substeps, I select 4 substeps with 32 constraint iterations each. However, as you've seen in the animation, at the end it's still a bit jittery, so we might feel tempted to increase the substeps to maybe 6. So that took a good bit longer to simulate, however results in a bit of a smoother animation. As always when it comes to simulations, you just have to fiddle and tweak the parameters to your individual setup and always have to compromise between speed and simulation precision. However, let's just stick with that, and although I'll provide a rendering file set up to render in Octane, I won't go over shading here. I just want to point out a few things which I'll do to the geometry before piping it into a render engine. So after the vellum solver, I'm going to use the vellum post process to first add a bit of spatial blur here, smoothing out the geometry a bit, and then adding one subdivision of loop subdivision, increasing the geometry's resolution here. And finally, I want to extrude my rubber bands to give them a bit of thickness, so when I scroll down in the vellum post process here, I can check extrude by thickness, which takes into account exactly these individual points scales that we set up in the vellum cloth. However, for rendering, as I figured out by just throwing away hours of render time, when you set the thickness scale to be exactly 1, sometimes sometimes those geometries intersect just a tiny bit, which doesn't matter if you have a diffuse shader on there. However, as soon as you have a refractive material, such as in our case, these tiny intersections become very obvious and very flickery. So what I did is just set this thickness scale to 0.9, which still looks close to the original, however now avoids intersections. And then finally I added normals, just using the normal node, and then used that to render it in Octane. Again, a render file will be provided with the other scene files in here. But that's the setup. Really easy rubber band ball using vellum. And if you want to learn more about vellum or other parts of Houdini, such as using volumes, particles, or just getting started, or maybe are interested in even some Unreal Engine, or just plainly want to support us, consider becoming a patron of ours, as it's with the help of our patrons that we are able to run in Tagma the way we currently do. And to everyone already supporting us out there, thanks so much, folks. It is through your help that we are able to do all this. And a very special thank you goes out to Lusion, Important Looking Pirates, Electric Theater, Rodeo Effects, Random 42 R&D, Side Effects, and Rafik Anadol Studios. Thanks so much for supporting us. So, as always, if you create artwork using one of our techniques, just tag us, send it along our way. We're always intrigued to see what you cook up. And until next time, as always, it is cheers and goodbye.
これは重いな。そっか、今サブステップ上げてんのか。だからこんな重いのか。 旦、まあ、これで吸着する感じになりました。モード自体はめちゃくちゃシンプルで、メインとなっているのがベラムクロスを使ったベラムシミュレーションで、クロスの性質をスティフネスの値をストレッチとベンドで、それぞれ設定していて、ストレッチはしやすい、ベンドはしづらいみたいな感じで、曲げにくく伸びやすいみたいな性質を与えて、ソルバーの中でベラムソースのオブジェクトを前触れエミットしてあげて、で、前触れの計算時にベラムコンストレイントプロパティでリストレングスを 0.3 にすることで収縮していくみたいなセットアップですね。ポップアトラクトとポップラングルがいまいちわかんなかったんだろうな。さっきあれか、フォースが弱かったから吸着しなかったのかな。中心点は変わらないんだ。そうだと100にして、とかにしてずらしてあげると。ディスタンスが近すぎる。中心はずれてるっちゃずれてるように見えるけど、ずれてるな。スケールが弱かったんだな。で、そこにコンストレイントがないから、コンストレイントがない場合、これどうやって収縮していくんだろう。自分自体がコンストレイントになるのかな。ぽいな。ぽいね。なるほど。はい、というわけで、ポップアトラクトは、やっぱり、引きつける性質を持ってる、ゴールポジションを決めていて、そこに向かって、このリボンみたいのが吸い寄せられて、そこに集まっていくのが、さっきは多分フォースが10だったんであんまり影響力が出てなかったけど、フォースのスケール上げたらちゃんとずれたので、多分そういう使い方なんだろうなと思います。ポップラングルのベロシティをゼロにしてんのがよくわかんなかったんだな。でも動いてるってことはベロシティが発生 してるわけだから、普通にあるもんな。ゼロにしてるけど。英語を聞き返すしかなさそうだな。なんで、この辺とかのやつをこう、今回転させてるのを、例えば回転させずに、こう、ダーッと上から下にダーって、ポップアトラクトの中心点を動かせば、均等にこう、ダラダラっと並べることができたりとか、なんか、うまいことやればできそう、いろいろできそうな気がします。はい。じゃあ一旦、今日はこんな感じです。はい。あとはなかったかな。ベラムソルバーの中がメインだけど、あとベラムポストプロセスで、サブディビジョンをかけてあげたりとか、厚みを出してあげてたりとかしてますね。スムースじゃねえ。角とベルの方がいいのか。レベルになっちゃうのか。これってもしかしてプリン、そっか、プリンティングの集合だもんな。それこうなっちゃう。いいや、なんか処理重くなるし。リタングルとか入れなくていいのかな。近くの平均値を見たらみたいなっていうか。上にでも結局角取れねえんだよな。スムースじゃ取れないのか。トレングス。 旦今日はここまでにします。レンダリングは後でやっておきます。ご視聴ありがとうございました。